Girl, ain't no man ever gonna choose you. Not
The
with what's under that
high-pitched
hood.
sneers of the church circle women hit Kemi before she can cross the street. They aren't just laughing, they are narrating her worthlessness for the whole block to hear. Kemi clutching her grocery bags, a symbol of her mundane, vulnerable life, while her heart pounds against her chest. One of the women points directly at Kemi's oversized hoodie. Girl, ain't no man ever gonna choose you. Not with what's under that hood. Kemi's jaw tightens, but she keeps her spine straight. She doesn't cry, because tears only fuel their cruelty. The cruel cackles are cut short by the low, predatory hum of engines. A convoy of 3 black SUVs with tinted windows stops at the intersection.
Now, sister.
The block goes
Oh, stop
silent
it. You
because
are
the power
terrible.
dynamic has shifted from petty bullies to dangerous authority. The window of the middle SUV slides down just a few inches. From the darkness, Choi Dong-hyun's sharp, tattooed eyes fixate on Kemi, the only person the rest of the world is mocking. He doesn't look away. Before we see how Choi Dong-hyun changes Kemi's life forever, hit the subscribe button for more stories of powerful women overcoming the impossible. Kemi didn't always walk with her chin tucked into the shadow of a cotton hood. Before the world became a place of whispers and averted eyes, she was the crown jewel of Lawson's Hearth, her father's celebrated restaurant in the heart of the city. Her father, Samuel, was a man who seasoned his food with laughter, and her mother, Elena, was the grace that moved between the tables. To Kemi, the kitchen wasn't just a place of work. It was a sanctuary of golden light and the sweet, herbaceous scent of her father's signature sauces. But the light went out the night the Grace Tropic ignited. It happened in a heartbeat, a roar of orange flame that turned the sanctuary into a cage. Kemi remembered the heat most of all. It was a living thing that clawed at her skin as she tried to reach her parents. She remembered her father's last act, shoving her toward the fire exit as the ceiling groaned. She woke up 3 days later in a sterile hospital ward, her face wrapped in bandages and her soul shattered. Her parents were gone, and the hearth was nothing but ash and blackened timber. That was when Denise arrived. She wasn't a woman of comfort, but a woman of calculation. Having married Samuel only a year prior, she stepped into the vacuum of Kemi's grief with the precision of a predator. While Kemi was still drifting through a morphine haze, Denise was busy with the insurance adjusters and the lawyers. She spoke of managing the estate and protecting Kemi's future, but her eyes remained as cold as the stethoscopes in the room. By the time Kemi was discharged, the transformation was complete. Denise had used the insurance payout not to rebuild the restaurant, but to purchase a sprawling, cold mansion on the outskirts of town, a house that felt more like a fortress than a home. The remaining funds were locked away in accounts Kemi couldn't touch, signed over to Denise under the guise of guardianship during Kemi's incapacity. The woman who had once smiled at Kemi across the dinner table now looked at her with a mixture of disgust and opportunism. Denise saw Kemi not as a daughter, but as a reminder of a debt she never intended to pay. She fired the cleaning staff, handing the mops and bleach to the girl with the trembling, scarred hands. "You should be grateful," Denise would hiss, her voice like sandpaper. "Who else would take in a girl who looks like you? You're a liability, Kemi. The least you can do is earn your keep." And so, the heiress to a culinary legacy became a ghost in a hoodie. Kemi surrendered her name and her face, retreating into the service entrance of her own life, while Denise and her daughter Brianna lived off the ghost of Samuel Lawson's hard work, waiting for the day they could finally erase Kemi entirely. In the cold, cavernous rooms of the Lawson mansion, Kemi had become a master of silence. Her life was measured in the rhythm of chores that never ended and the stinging scent of industrial-strength ammonia. Every morning began at 5 a.m., long before the sun dared to touch the windows, as she scrubbed the marble floors on her knees. The house was a monument to her father's hard work, yet Kemi was forbidden from sitting on the furniture or using the front door. She was a ghost in a hoodie, a shadow that moved through the hallways only to erase the footprints of the two women who lived there as queens. Denise and Brianna treated Kemi's presence as a personal affront. To them, she wasn't family. She was a broken piece of equipment they couldn't quite bring themselves to throw away. Brianna, draped in silk robes and the latest fashion, took a particular twisted pleasure in making Kemi's life a living hell. She would intentionally spill red wine on the cream carpets just to watch Kemi's scarred hands tremble as she scrubbed, or leave piles of laundry outside her door at midnight with a sharp kick to the wood. "Make sure the silver is polished before the bridge club arrives," Denise would command, her eyes never leaving her tablet. "And keep that hood up. I won't have the guests losing their appetite because they caught a glimpse of your face." The damaged goods label wasn't just a metaphor. It was a psychological cage Denise had built around Kemi, brick by brick. Every mirror in the common areas had been removed or positioned so Kemi couldn't see her reflection, reinforcing the idea that she was too hideous to be looked upon. Over time, the constant barrage of insults began to feel like truth. When Denise called her worthless or unlovable, Kemi's heart didn't even protest anymore. She had been conditioned to believe that her value had perished in the same grease fire that took her parents. By mid-afternoon, Kemi would usually be sent out for errands, the only time she was allowed to leave the property. These walks were her only escape, yet they were fraught with their own pain. She wore the oversized gray hoodie like armor, pulling the drawstring tight to hide the jagged lines of scar tissue that crawled up her neck. She walked with her head down, counting the cracks in the sidewalk, trying to become invisible. She was a woman who had been told so many times that no man would ever choose her that she had finally stopped choosing herself. She lived in the in-between, a servant in her own inheritance, waiting for a life she feared would never come. The heavy grocery bags cut into Kemi's palms as she took her usual shortcut through the narrow alleyway behind the shopping district. It was a place of damp brick and rusted fire escapes, a mirror to her own hidden life. She was halfway through the passage when a sound stopped her, a low, wet cough that vibrated with pain. Kemi froze. In the shadows behind a row of industrial dumpsters, a man was slumped against the wall. He wore a suit that looked more expensive than anything Kemi owned combined, but it was ruined. Dark, visceral crimson was spreading across his white shirt, soaking through the fabric with terrifying speed. His head was lolling back, exposing a sharp jawline and the edge of intricate, dark tattoos that climbed up his neck like vines. Any other person in her position would have run, but Kemi knew what it was like to be left in the dark. She knew what it felt like to have the world walk past while you were braking. Dropping her bags, she knelt in the grime beside him. "Sir, can you hear me?" Her voice was soft, muffled by her hood. The man's eyes snapped open, piercing obsidian depths that even in a state of shock held a terrifying intensity. He gasped, his hand flying to his side, but Kemi didn't flinch. She reached out, her scarred hands steady as she pressed her own hoodie against the wound to stem the flow. "Don't move," she whispered. "I've got you." The man, Choi Dong-hyun, looked at her through a haze of agony. He saw only a shadow in a gray hoodie, but he felt the strength in her grip. "Leave," he managed to choke out, his voice a gravelly rasp. "I'm not leaving you to bleed out in the dirt," Kemi replied, her voice ringing with a quiet authority she hadn't felt in years. She reached into her bag, pulling out a bottle of water and a clean kitchen towel she'd been sent to buy. With practiced ease, the kind learned from years of treating her own burns and blisters, she began to clean the perimeter of the wound. For 20 minutes, she stayed. She ignored the distant sirens and the fear that his attackers might return. She talked to him in a low, grounding hum, telling him about the stars she could see through the gap in the buildings. Anything to keep him conscious. Dong-hyun watched her, his gaze narrowing as he tracked the movement of her hands. He noticed she never let her hood fall, never showed her face, yet she gave him her warmth without hesitation. When the sound of heavy boots and the hum of black SUVs finally echoed at the mouth of the alley, Dong-hyun's men arrived like a storm. They surged forward, guns drawn, but stopped dead when they saw the girl in the hoodie. She didn't move until she was sure they were his. Only then did she stand, picking up her groceries and retreating back into the shadows before they could see the face she worked so hard to hide. She left behind a man who had never been saved by anyone, and who would never forget the touch of the stranger in the gray hood. In the days that followed, Kemi felt as though the air in the city had shifted. The alleyway encounter had been a fever dream of blood and shadow, yet the memory of those obsidian eyes remained scorched into her mind. She returned to her life of servitude, scrubbing floors and enduring Denise's sharp-tongued barbs, but the silence of the house felt less heavy. The change began on a Tuesday. Kemi was at the local park taking her mandated 30-minute break between grocery runs, sitting on a secluded bench where the weeping willows hid her from the world. A shadow fell over her, cool and steady. She looked up, her hand instinctively tightening the drawstring of her hood, only to see a man standing there. He wasn't in a ruined suit this time. He wore a charcoal cashmere coat that screamed quiet wealth, and his hands, covered in the faint traceries of dark ink, were tucked into his pockets. "You're hard to find," Choi Dong-hyen said. His voice was no longer a death-rattle rasp. It was a deep, resonant velvet that made Kemi's breath hitch. "I'm not supposed to be found," Kemi whispered, looking down at her worn sneakers. "You shouldn't be here. It's not safe for someone like you." Dong-hyun didn't leave. Instead, he sat on the far end of the bench, respecting the space she clearly needed. He placed a steaming paper cup on the wood between them. "Early Grey, 2 sugars. I remembered the smell of the tea bags in your grocery bag that night." Kemi stared at the cup. No one had remembered her preferences in years. For the next hour, they sat in a strange, beautiful pocket of peace. He didn't ask her to lower her hood. He didn't ask about the fire or the scars he surely knew were there. Instead, he talked about the architecture of the city, the way the light hit the harbor at dawn, and the childhood he'd spent in Seoul. He spoke to her not as a victim, but as an equal, a resourceful stranger who had saved his life when his own men couldn't. 2 hours, said Kemi as she finally stood to leave, terrified of Denise's wrath if she were late. Every Tuesday and Thursday, tea for 2 hours, no questions, no demands, just time. As the weeks passed, these 2-hour windows became Kemi's lifeline. Dong-hyen treated her with a protective authority that felt like a shield. When a passerby stared too long at her hoodie, one look from Dong-hyen's cold, intense gaze would send them scurrying away. He brought her books, small delicacies from the Korean bakery, and most importantly, he brought her his undivided attention. For those 2 hours, Kemi wasn't damaged goods or an unpaid maid. She was a woman being courted by a man who saw her strength as a diamond, forged in the very fire that had tried to consume her. She was beginning to remember how to breathe, unaware that the man across from her was already planning to burn down the world that had kept her in the dark. The shift in Kemi's world became a seismic fracture on a Friday afternoon when a courier in a crisp black uniform arrived at the mansion. He didn't ring the back doorbell. He marched straight to the front, handing over an envelope of heavy, gold-flecked vellum. Denise snatched it with a greed that made her fingers tremble. Inside was a formal invitation to the annual Choi Foundation Gala, the most exclusive event in the city's social calendar. It was an evening where power shook hands with old money, and for the first time it was being hosted by the mysterious and reclusive new chairman of the Choi Syndicate. "This is it," Denise breathed, her eyes darting across the elegant script. "This is Brianna's moment. One dance with a man of that caliber and we are set for life." Kemi, standing in the foyer with a bucket of soapy water, felt a strange jolt in her chest. The name Choi wasn't just a corporate title to her anymore. It was the name of the man who brought her Earl Grey tea and treated her like a human being. The invitation says to the Lawson household and guests, Kemi said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Does that mean I could go? The laughter that erupted from Denise was sharp and jagged like breaking glass. She turned to Kemi, her face contorting with a sneer of pure malice. You want to go to a gala? She stepped closer, invading Kemi's space until the scent of her expensive perfume stifled the air. Look at yourself, Kemi. You're a servant, a scarred, broken thing that lives in the pantry. You turn the stomach of every guest in that ballroom. Brianna walked down the stairs, already scrolling through dress designs on her phone. Mom, tell her to stop dreaming. She'd probably try to hide her face behind a silk napkin all night. You aren't going anywhere near that hotel, Denise hissed, her voice dropping to a dangerous low. In fact, you'll stay right here and deep clean the attic while we're out. I want every trace of your father's old junk boxed up and ready for the landfill. If I catch so much as a shadow of you near the front door that night, you'll be on the street before the clock strikes 12. Denise tucked the golden invitation into her clutch as if it were a weapon. To her, it was a ticket to a higher world. To Kemi, it was a confirmation of her deepest fears, that no matter how kind the stranger in the park was, she would always be a prisoner of the shadows Denise had cast over her. As she watched them plan their evening of luxury, Kemi felt the familiar weight of resignation. But deep in her pocket, she felt the small, smooth stone Dong-hyun had given her during their last meeting. A reminder that some fires don't just destroy, they forge something stronger than ash. The night of the gala arrived like a heavy velvet curtain, pressing down on the silence of the mansion. Kemi waited until the taillights of Denise's luxury sedan faded into the distance before she moved. She didn't head to the attic to box up her father's legacy as commanded. Instead, she went to the floorboards beneath her small, cramped bed and pulled out a garment bag she had hidden for years. Inside was her mother's gown, a breathtaking column of midnight blue silk that shimmered like a deep ocean under moonlight. When Kemi slipped it on, the fabric felt like a lost embrace. She draped a delicate matching lace shawl over her head and shoulders, pinning it carefully so it acted as a veil, masking the jagged landscape of her neck and jaw. She didn't look in a mirror. She didn't need to. She simply followed the pull of the stone in her pocket, a silent promise from the man who saw her in the dark. The grand starlight ballroom was a dizzying swirl of gold leaf and crystal chandeliers. Kemi slipped through the service entrance, blending into the periphery of the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She only wanted to see him, to see the man who gave her tea and dignity from a distance. But the world has a way of finding what it wants to hurt. Kemi? The voice was a venomous whip. Kemi froze as Denise and Brianna stepped out from behind a floral arrangement, their faces twisting from shock to incandescent rage. You miserable, pathetic creature, Denise hissed, her voice vibrating with quiet fury so the nearby socialites wouldn't hear. You stole that dress. You dared to bring your filth into this room? Before Kemi could retreat, Brianna reached out with a cruel, mocking laugh and yanked at the lace shawl. Let's see what you're trying to hide, shall we? Everyone should see the monster at the party. The lace gave way with a sickening tear. Kemi's hood fell, exposing the raw, silvered scars of the fire to the brilliant glare of the chandeliers. The nearby conversations died instantly. Gasps rippled through the circle of elite guests as they recoiled, their eyes filling with the pity and disgust Kemi had spent years fleeing. Denise leaned in, her eyes gleaming with triumph. Look at them, Kemi. No man would ever choose a freak like... I chose her weeks ago. The voice was cold, lethal, and loud enough to shatter the silence. The crowd parted like a receding tide as Choi Dong-fyun stepped into the light. He wasn't the soft-spoken stranger from the park. He was a king in a bespoke black suit, his tattooed hand resting on the hilt of a cane, his presence radiating a dangerous, absolute authority. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't even look at the trembling Denise. His eyes, burning with a fierce, protective intensity, were fixed solely on Kemi. He walked toward her, ignoring the scars she tried to cover with her hands, and reached out. Gently, firmly, he took her scarred hand in his and brought it to his lips. "I've been waiting for my dance, Kemi," he whispered, his voice carrying through the hushed room. "And I don't care who is watching." The silence in the ballroom was no longer the heavy, suffocating weight of judgment. It had become a vacuum of awe. Choi Dong-hyun did not wait for the whispers to resume. With a grace that contradicted his lethal reputation, he led Kemi toward the center of the polished dance floor. The orchestra, sensing the shift in the room's gravity, began a slow, sweeping waltz that seemed to breathe life back into the frozen space. As they moved, the world beyond the circle of their arms ceased to exist. Denise stood at the edge of the floor, her face a mask of pale, twitching fury, while Brianna clutched her stolen silk dress in stunned silence. They were invisible now, relegated to the status of background noise. Dong-hyun's hand remained steady on Kemi's waist, his touch a grounding force that countered the trembling in her knees. "Look at me, Kemi," he murmured, his voice a private sanctuary amidst the hundreds of staring eyes. Kemi looked up, meeting the obsidian intensity of his gaze. In his eyes, she didn't see a monster or damaged goods. She saw the woman who had stayed in a dark alley to save a stranger. She saw the woman who had shared her time and her spirit over Earl Grey tea. "They think they've unmasked you to shame you," Dong-hyun said, his eyes never wavering. "They think beauty is something that can be burned away. But I have seen your soul, and it is the most beautiful thing in this room. Let them see what I see." At his words, something deep within Kemi, a wall of shame she had built brick by brick since the fire, began to crumble. She realized that by hiding, she was agreeing with Denise's cruelty. She was letting the fire win. With a slow, deliberate movement, Kemi reached up. She didn't reach for the torn lace to pull it back over her head. Instead, she let the remaining silk slide from her shoulders, baring her neck and the silvered patterns of her scars to the full, unapologetic light of the chandeliers. She stood tall, her spine straightening with the dignity of the father she had lost. For the first time in years, she didn't tuck her chin or avert her eyes. She danced with the most powerful man in the city, her face uncovered, her spirit finally stepping out of the shadows. The socialites who had gasped in horror now watched in a different kind of silence, a silence of profound realization. They weren't looking at a victim, they were looking at a queen being claimed by her king. In that moment, the choice was no longer just Dong-hyun's, it was Kemi's. She had chosen to believe in her own worth, and the fire that had once nearly destroyed her was now nothing more than the light that made her shine. The music had stopped, but the atmosphere remained electric, charged with the quiet terror of those who had suddenly realized they were on the wrong side of history. Dong-hyun did not move from Kemi's side. He didn't need to raise his voice to command the room. His presence alone was a gavel coming down. "The gala is a celebration of justice," Dong-hyun announced, his voice slicing through the remnants of Denise's composure. "And tonight, justice begins with a debt long overdue." At a sharp nod from Dong-hyun, a side door opened and a phalanx of men in sharp charcoal gray suits entered, not soldiers of the street, but soldiers of the courtroom. Leading them was a woman with a silver briefcase and eyes as cold as a winter morning in Seoul. She approached the podium, projecting a series of documents onto the massive screens that lined the ballroom. "For 3 years, the attorney began, her voice echoing off the gold-leafed ceiling, the estate of Samuel Lawson has been systematically drained under the guise of guardianship. We have recovered the original maintenance logs from Lawson's hearth. The grease trap that caused the fire didn't malfunction by accident. It was tampered with, the safety valves manually overridden 48 hours before the ignition." A collective gasp swept through the socialites. Denise's face drained of color, turning a sickly, translucent white. "That's a lie," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "It was an unfortunate kitchen accident." The attorney continued, unfazed. "We have the forensic digital trail of the insurance payout. Funds that were meant for Kemi Lawson's medical care and the rebuilding of her father's legacy were diverted into offshore accounts to pay for this mansion and your daughter's lifestyle. Furthermore, we have a signed deposition from the contractor you hired to hide the evidence of the tampering." Dong-hyun stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Denise. "You called her a liability," he said, the words falling like stones into a deep well. "You called her damaged goods. But the only thing damaged in this house was the conscience of the woman who stole a child's inheritance while she lay in a hospital bed." The double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open, revealing the local authorities. There was no dramatic chase, no loud protest. Denise and Brianna were led out in a silence so profound it was deafening. As the handcuffs clicked shut, Kemi felt the invisible chains that had bound her to that cold house finally snap. She wasn't just being chosen by a man, she was being restored by the truth. Dong-hyun turned back to her, his expression softening as he leaned in. "The house is yours again, Kemi. The restaurant, the name, and the future. They can never take the light from you again." The seasons turned, and with them, the ash of Kemi's past was tilled into the soil of a vibrant new beginning. The Lawson mansion, once a cold fortress of domestic imprisonment, was sold to fund a dream that Samuel Lawson would have wept to see. In the heart of the city, where the charred remains of the old restaurant once stood, the Lawson Foundation now rose, a state-of-the-art center dedicated to the rehabilitation and empowerment of fire survivors and those scarred by domestic trauma. Kemi didn't just fund the foundation, she moved through its halls every day. She no longer wore a hoodie. Instead, she walked with her face open to the world, her scars a map of a journey that ended in victory. She became the voice for the voiceless, the woman who proved that a damaged exterior was merely the casing for an unbreakable soul. The final healing, however, took place on a golden afternoon in the garden of Choi Dong-hyun's private estate. It was a wedding that lacked the cold pretense of the gala. There were no cameras, no judgmental socialites, only a small circle of those who had learned the true meaning of loyalty. Dong-hyun stood at the end of an aisle lined with white lilies and Korean plum blossoms. When Kemi appeared, she was a vision in ivory lace, her mother's wedding veil trailing behind her like a soft cloud. She didn't use it to hide. As she reached him, Dong-hyun took both of her hands, his thumbs tracing the silver patterns on her skin with a reverence that made her breath catch. "They said no man would ever choose you," Dong-hyun whispered, his voice thick with a rare, raw emotion as they stood before the officiant. He looked at the woman who saved his life in a dark alley and then saved his heart in the light of day. "They didn't realize that the world wasn't worthy of you. I didn't choose you because of a face, Kemi. I chose you because, in a world of shadows, you were the only light I could find." As they exchanged rings, the predatory intensity that Dong-hyun usually carried for the world softened into a profound peace. Kemi looked at her husband and then back at the life she had reclaimed. She realized that the fire hadn't taken everything. It had simply burned away the people and the pretenses that didn't matter, leaving behind a love that was fireproof. As the sun set, painting the garden in hues of honey and rose, Kemi Lawson, now Choi, leaned into her husband's side. The girl who had been told she was unlovable was now the most cherished woman in the city. Her story wasn't just about a mafia boss arriving to save her. It was about the moment she realized she was worth saving all along. The shadows were gone, and for Kemi, the sun was finally, beautifully, here to stay.